Imagine for a moment it's the year 700, and your husband, the man who vowed to protect and provide for you, simply vanishes. One morning he is there, the next he is gone, leaving you utterly alone. Your heart pounds, a cold dread settles deep in your belly. What do you do when your world collapses in an instant? How do you survive when society offers no safety net, only a cruel array of terrifying options? Number 6. Seeking solace and submission in a religious life. In the dimly lit hovels and sprawling manor houses of 700 AD, where candles flickered and smoky fires offered the only warmth, a woman's identity was often inextricably linked to her husband and family. When that anchor was ripped away by abandonment, one profoundly grim choice, cloaked in spiritual solace, was to enter a religious institution. This was not always a choice born of fervent faith, but often a stark negotiation with desperation, a surrender of personal freedom for a meager semblance of security. Consider the life of a woman in Anglo-Saxon England during this period. Her society, still grappling with the conversion from paganism to Christianity, saw the monastic life as a path to salvation, but also as a dumping ground for the unwanted or the utterly bereft. If a woman's husband abandoned her, leaving her without a male protector or provider, she became an outcast, a social anomaly. Her dowry, if she even had one, would have been consumed by the marriage, and her family, if they were even alive or willing to take her back, might view her as a burden, a mark of shame. Convent, for all its strictures, offered a roof over her head, daily bread, and protection from the brutal realities of a world that had little mercy for lone women. Prospect of entering a convent in 708 was far from the serene image often conjured. These were not always havens of gentle contemplation. Life was rigorous, demanding, and often harsh. A woman would rise before dawn for prayers, spend hours in laborious tasks, from tending gardens and livestock to copying manuscripts by hand, all while adhering to vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience. Personal possessions were surrendered, family ties severed, and individuality subsumed under the communal rule. It was a life of quiet sacrifice, a living death to the world she once knew, all for the promise of spiritual redemption and, more immediately, physical survival. In the Byzantine Empire, a woman similarly abandoned might also look to the church, specifically a monastery. The Eastern Church held immense sway, and monasteries were not only centers of piety, but also significant landowners and social institutions. For a woman like Theodora, abandoned by a merchant husband who had sailed away and never returned, the monastery of St. Euphemia might have seemed the only viable refuge. She would have traded her colorful tunics for the somber black habit of a nun, her days of managing a household for a strict regimen of prayer, fasting, and manual labor. As Dr. Anya Sharma meticulously details in her seminal work, The Silent Sisters, Monastic Life in Early Byzantium, these institutions provided a degree of social welfare that no other entity offered, but at the cost of profound personal freedom and the erasure of one's former identity. Theodora would no longer be a wife, a potential mother, or an independent agent in the world. She would be Sister Theodora, a servant of God, and nothing more. In the burgeoning Islamic societies of the Near East, a similar yet distinct set of circumstances applied. While Islam provided some rights for abandoned wives, the practical realities of enforcement in the rough-and-tumble societies of 700 AD were often bleak. A woman might have the theoretical right to maintenance from her absent husband, but proving abandonment or enforcing decrees against a man who had vanished or simply refused to acknowledge her could be impossible. In such cases, some women might have sought refuge within religious endowments or charitable institutions linked to mosques or wealthy patrons. These were not convents in the Christian sense, but they might offer a secure place, food, and the opportunity for religious scholarship or charitable work, a way to survive without resorting to the dangers of the street or the ignominy of prostitution. For instance, A woman like Aisha, whose nomadic husband had ridden away with his tribe and not returned, might have found herself utterly destitute in a bustling city like Damascus. With no family protection and no means of support, her options were dire. She could appeal to a mosque for charity, or perhaps find a place within a waqf, a religious endowment that supported pious individuals or provided for the poor. Her days would be spent in devotion, perhaps assisting in the upkeep of the mosque or teaching the Quran to young girls. While she retained more personal autonomy than a Christian nun, her life would still be circumscribed by religious observance and a distinct lack of personal agency, a direct consequence of her abandonment. Dr. Karim Al-Fassi, in Women and the Veil, Private Lives in Early Islamic Society, posits that for many women, these institutions were a sanctuary of necessity, a place where spiritual life became intertwined with the stark need for survival. The decision to embrace a religious life was a profound one, often irreversible. Once a woman took her vows, whether as a nun in Christian Europe or a devout scholar in a Muslim charitable foundation, she was expected to remain in that state until her death. There was no easy exit, no turning back if her husband suddenly reappeared or if her circumstances changed. Her life was now defined by the rules of her order, not by her own desires or ambitions. It was a trade-off safety and sustenance for freedom and the possibility of a different kind of life. For many women in 700, this grim choice, though offering a form of salvation, was a testament to the limited and desperate options available to them when their world was shattered by abandonment. It was a path of quiet desperation, a forced surrender to the divine out of human need. Number 5. Enduring the perils of independent labor. When the last ember of hope flickered out and her husband's absence stretched into an undeniable abandonment, many women in 700 had faced the terrifying prospect of sustaining themselves through their own labor. This was not the modern idea of a career or a chosen profession. This was a grim, often brutal fight for daily survival, undertaken in a world utterly unprepared to support independent women, especially those without the protection of a man. The dangers were manifold, the rewards meager, and the social stigma crushing. Imagine Ilara living in a small village in what would someday be France. Her husband, a simple peasant farmer, had left for a distant market and never returned. Ilara had no land of her own, no male relatives to claim her or her children, and a meager set of skills suited only for the domestic sphere. The village elders would frown upon her. Without a man to work the fields, her small plot of land would lie fallow. Taxes would go unpaid, and hunger would quickly become her constant companion. Her only recourse was to sell her labor, a physically demanding and often humiliating proposition. She might attempt to become a laundress, scrubbing heavy woolen materials in cold river water until her hands were raw and aching, earning a pittance that barely bought a loaf of bread. Or perhaps she would seek work as a field hand, toiling alongside men from dawn until dusk, her back breaking under the sun or in the biting wind for wages that were invariably lower than a man's, simply because she was a woman. The risk of injury was high, and any ailment could mean utter destitution. As Professor Alistair Finch notes in The Silent Fields, women's agricultural labor in early medieval Europe. Women performing heavy agricultural work were often pushed to their physical limits, risking malnutrition and chronic pain for wages that offered no security. The social implications of independent labor for a woman in 700 AD were devastating. An abandoned woman working for herself was often viewed with suspicion. She was seen as unprotected and therefore vulnerable to exploitation, but also as potentially promiscuous, because why else would a woman be out alone in the world? Her reputation, already tarnished by her husband's desertion, would sink further. She might be propositioned by men subject to verbal abuse or even physical assault with little recourse for justice. in a system that valued female chastity above all else, especially if she was not under a man's direct authority. In Anglo-Saxon England, a woman like Aethelthryth, whose fisherman husband was lost at sea, would face a similar struggle. She might try to spin wool into yarn, a laborious process that could occupy her for hours each day, selling her output to local traders for pennies. Or she might try brewing ale, a common female occupation, but one that required initial capital for ingredients and equipment, a capital she likely lacked. The market for such goods would be local and saturated, making a steady income precarious. Her meager earnings would have to stretch to feed her children, if she had any, and keep a roof over their heads, often a leaky, drafty one. Her life would be a relentless cycle of toil, hunger, and anxiety. The Anglo-Saxon charters, while sparse on details of individual women's lives, hint at a society where the unattached woman was a marginal figure, often reliant on charity or driven to the fringes of society, as outlined in Dr. Joanna Blackwood's Lone Women in Early England. A study of survival. Across the sea in the Byzantine Empire, an abandoned woman might find herself in Constantinople, a bustling metropolis, but one equally harsh for the unmoored. She might attempt to sell simple foodstuffs in the market, a few eggs or handfuls of herbs gleaned from the countryside, vying with countless other vendors for a meager profit. Or she might become a domestic servant in a wealthy household, trading her freedom for a small wage and bed and board. But even domestic service was precarious. A servant could be dismissed without notice, subjected to the whims and abuses of her masters, and would have no legal standing if wronged. Her only protection was the mercy of those who employed her, a mercy rarely extended without self-interest. Consider the narrative of Helena, a young woman abandoned by a soldier who had marched off to distant wars and never returned. She found work as a seamstress, mending garments for a few coppers. Her days were spent hunched over delicate material, her eyes strained by poor light. She lived in a small, rented room, barely larger than a cupboard, and often went hungry. Every illness was a catastrophe, every lost day of work a direct threat to her survival. The Byzantine legal codes, while granting some protections to women, primarily focused on wives within legitimate marriages. For a woman like Helena, no longer a wife, and not yet a widow, the law offered little recourse, leaving her exposed to the caprices of a society that valued male patronage above all else. This stark reality is painted vividly in Byzantine Women, Lives on the Edge of Empire by Dr. Constantina Pappas, who highlights the constant struggle for autonomy and basic survival faced by unattached women. In Tang Dynasty China, a woman abandoned by her husband faced a similar uphill battle. Traditional Confucian society placed immense emphasis on family structure and female subservience within it. An abandoned woman, without a father or brother to return to, would find herself in an untenable position. She might try to find work as a wet nurse if she had recently given birth, or as a general servant in a wealthy household. Some might attempt to open a small tea house or work in the burgeoning urban entertainment districts as musicians or dancers, but these professions carried immense social stigma and often bordered on prostitution, another grim choice. Li Hua, for instance, whose scholarly husband left her for a more politically advantageous marriage, found herself without support in the sprawling city of Chang'an. Her refined upbringing offered her no practical skills for survival. She could attempt to sell embroidered items, a skill taught to all noble women, but the market was flooded, and her delicate health, unaccustomed to physical strain, quickly deteriorated. She was forced to take on low-paying domestic work, cleaning and cooking for merchants, a far cry from her previous life of relative comfort. Her life was a constant struggle against poverty and illness, a stark illustration of the vulnerability of women outside the prescribed social structures. As documented in The Forgotten Faces, Women in Tang, China, by Professor Mei Lin. Choice: to attempt independent labor was a desperate gamble against overwhelming odds. It promised little more than relentless toil, social ostracization, and constant vulnerability. For many, it was a path that led to exhaustion, illness, and ultimately destitution. A grim testament to the systemic disadvantages faced by women in 700 AD when left to fend for themselves. It was a life defined by unending struggle, a battle fought alone against the relentless tide of poverty and societal disapproval. Number 4. Returning to the patriarchal shelter of her birth family. For a woman abandoned by her husband in 700 AD, one of the least desirable, yet often only immediate options, was to return to her birth family. This was not a comforting embrace, but a fraught negotiation, a step backwards into a life of diminished status and potential shame. The decision to go back to her father's or brother's house was a public admission of her failed marriage, and her husband's desertion, a blight upon her family's reputation and a burden on their resources. Consider the social structures of the time. Marriages were often strategic alliances between families, solidifying property, power, or social standing. A woman's dowry, if she had one, would have passed to her husband's family upon marriage. When a husband abandoned her, this dowry was rarely, if ever, returned. She arrived back at her paternal home, stripped of her marriage portion and with nothing to contribute except her own labor and the potential shame she brought. She was no longer a daughter marrying out with honor, but a cast-off, a woman who had failed in her primary societal role. In Anglo-Saxon society, the concept of kin was paramount. A woman was defined by her relation to male family members, daughter of her father, wife of her husband. When the latter tie was severed by abandonment, the former became her only recourse. However, this return was rarely welcomed with open arms. Her presence represented a new mouth to feed, another body to clothe, in households that often barely sustained themselves. Her brothers, now the heads of the family, might resent her presence, as she would be a drain on the family's inheritance and resources that might otherwise go to their own wives and children. Her status within the household would be somewhere between that of a dependent relative and a glorified servant. She might be tasked with the most arduous and least rewarding domestic chores, often out of sight, a perpetual reminder of her unfortunate circumstances. Imagine the scenario of Freya, a young woman abandoned by her chieftain husband, who had taken a new bride and banished Freya from his lands. She journeyed for weeks to reach her distant birth village. Her elder brother, now the head of their family, reluctantly took her in. Freya, once the proud wife of a chieftain, was now confined to the kitchen and the common hall, weaving rough materials and tending to the younger children. She would eat only after the men and their wives had finished, and her opinions, if she dared voice them, would be dismissed. She carried the stigma of the abandoned wife, a whisper that followed her like a shadow. As Professor Benedict Clark observes in Kinship and Crisis in Anglo-Saxon England, the reabsorption of an abandoned wife into her birth family was often a tense affair, characterized by economic strain and social discomfort, a test of the kin group's obligation rather than an act of pure compassion. In the Byzantine Empire, while property rights for women were somewhat more established than in other regions, the social pressure to maintain family honor was immense. An abandoned wife returning to her paternal home, especially without children, would be a source of profound embarrassment. Her father or brothers would feel compelled to take her in, but she would be treated as a perpetual dependent, with little hope of remarriage. Her marriage contract, if it existed, might theoretically allow her to reclaim her dowry, but enforcing this against an absent or unwilling husband or a hostile in-law family was a legal labyrinth that few women could navigate successfully. Consider Demetria, whose husband, a minor official, had fled Constantinople under suspicion of corruption, leaving her penniless. Her family, a moderately prosperous merchant clan, grudgingly allowed her to return. Demetria found herself relegated to the less prestigious tasks, managing the less important parts of the household. Her voice silenced in family decisions. Her sisters-in-law, who had married successfully and brought dowries, held higher standing. Demetria became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of what could happen when a marriage failed, a burden on her family's reputation and resources. Her days would be filled with a quiet despair, her former life a distant memory. Dr. L.E. Christodoulou, in her exhaustive study Household and Honor, The Byzantine Woman's Predicament, highlights how the return of an abandoned woman, while fulfilling a familial obligation, often created a social and economic strain that reverberated through the entire kin network. In the diverse regions under early Islamic rule, the situation for an abandoned woman returning home was nuanced. While Islamic law did grant women rights to property, and even a theoretical right to divorce if their husband was absent for an extended period, the societal norms often lagged behind the legal framework. A woman's reputation was tied to her chastity and her marriage. Returning home as an abandoned wife, especially without children to justify her presence, could bring dishonor. Her brothers might take her in out of religious duty or family obligation, but her future prospects would be severely limited. Remarriage, while permissible, might be difficult if her abandonment was widely known or if it cast a shadow on her character. For example, Fatima, whose husband, a camel trader, had simply vanished into the desert, was forced to return to her father's tent. Her father, a strict and traditional man, accepted her, but her presence was a constant source of quiet disapproval. She was expected to perform all the arduous domestic tasks, tending to the animals, grinding grain and preparing meals, without the recognition or respect afforded to her married sisters. Her life was one of quiet subservience, a public demonstration of her dependent status. She would live under the perpetual gaze of her male relatives, her every move scrutinized, her future defined by her family's willingness to provide for her, a willingness often tinged with resentment. As the historical work, The Unseen Lives, Women in the Early Caliphate, by Dr. Zahra Abdullah, details, while some women might find genuine solace and support, many faced a return that was more akin to a dignified imprisonment than a warm welcome, marked by social ostracism. Choice to return to her birth family, while offering a measure of physical safety and sustenance, came at a steep price. It meant a drastic reduction in social standing, a life often devoid of personal autonomy, and the constant reminder of her unfortunate circumstances. She would live under the shadow of her husband's desertion, a perpetual dependent, beholden to the whims and charity of her male relatives. For many women in 700, this was a difficult and emotionally draining option, a grim path that sacrificed personal dignity for bare survival within a system that had no comfortable place for the unattached woman. It was a life of quiet resignation, a bitter reminder of a world where a woman's worth was so often tied to her marital status. Number 3. Embracing the perilous life of a concubine or secondary wife. For a woman abandoned by her husband in 700, a truly grim and often humiliating option was to become a concubine or a secondary wife. This was not a pathway to love or partnership, but a desperate grab for survival, a trade of one form of dependence for another, often more precarious one. It meant accepting a life without true marital status, with limited or no rights for herself or her children, and constant vulnerability to the whims of her new master. Concept of concubinage existed in various forms across the globe in 700, from the courts of Tang, China, to the noble houses of the Byzantine Empire and the burgeoning Islamic caliphates. In all these contexts, a concubine was generally a woman who lived with a man as his sexual partner and bore his children, but without the full legal and social recognition of a wife. She might be a former slave, a war captive, or crucially, an abandoned woman with no other means of support. Her position was always secondary, always insecure. In Tang Dynasty, China, for example, the imperial court and wealthy households often kept numerous concubines. While some might rise to positions of influence, their status was fundamentally inferior to that of the principal wife. For a woman like Mei Ling, abandoned by her merchant husband who had lost his fortune and fled, becoming a concubine to a minor official might have seemed a step up from starvation. She would gain shelter, food, and clothing, perhaps even a chance for her children to be acknowledged by a powerful man. However, her life would be a constant battle for attention and resources against other concubines, and more importantly against the principal wife, who held all the true authority. Principal wife could be cruel, capricious, and held immense power over the concubines and their children, often treating them as little more than servants. Mei Ling would have faced the daily fear of being discarded if she displeased her master or failed to produce a male heir. Her children, while potentially recognized, would always be considered inferior to those born of the principal wife with lesser inheritance, rights, and social standing. Her very existence was contingent upon her master's desire and her ability to remain fertile and pleasing. As Professor Zixin Ling writes in The Golden Cage, concubinage in Tang Dynasty society, while concubinage offered a veneer of security, it was fundamentally a life of servitude and profound insecurity, where a woman's value was non-existent. In the Byzantine Empire, while official concubinage was less formalized than in the East, the practice of keeping mistresses or secondary partners was common among the elite. For an abandoned woman of lower status, becoming a man's unofficial partner was a way to survive, but it came with immense social stigma. She would be seen as a woman of loose morals, a phallic, or hetaira, with no legal standing. Her children would be considered illegitimate, unable to inherit property or hold positions of honor. Imagine Sophia, abandoned by her husband, a soldier who perished in a distant campaign. With no family to take her in and no means to support herself, she accepted the offer of a wealthy senator to become his mistress. She lived in a smaller annex of his grand villa, given fine clothes and food, but she was always hidden from proper society. Her days were spent waiting for his visits, bearing his children, who would never truly be hers in the eyes of the law. She was a silent shadow, a comfort to him, but nothing more. The senator's legal wife, if she knew, would likely view Sophia with contempt, and Sophia herself would be ostracized by respectable society. Her future was entirely dependent on the senator's continued favor, and should he tire of her or pass away, she and her illegitimate children would be cast out onto the streets with nothing. Dr. Markella Stavro's detailed work, Women at the Margins, Illicit Relationships in Byzantine Society, vividly illustrates the social isolation and profound vulnerability that define the lives of such women. In the nascent Islamic world, concubinage, often through the acquisition of enslaved women, was a recognized social institution. While Islamic law granted certain rights to enslaved concubines if they bore children to their masters, who then became free upon their master's death, the life of a concubine was still one of submission. For an abandoned woman, perhaps a non-Muslim, captured in a raid, or a destitute free woman who sold herself into servitude, becoming a concubine offered a path to survival and perhaps even a measure of influence, particularly if she bore a son. However, this was a highly competitive and dangerous environment. The principal wife, often a woman of noble lineage, held undisputed authority. Concubines jockeyed for their master's favor, sometimes resorting to schemes and rivalries that could have deadly consequences. A concubine who failed to produce a male heir or whose master grew tired of her could be resold, gifted to another, or relegated to menial labor. Her children, while potentially acknowledged and free, would still hold a lower status than those born of a free wife. Consider the story of Zainab, abandoned by her husband, a merchant who left for trade and never returned. With her small children facing starvation, she was forced to seek protection from a powerful emir. She became his concubine, living in the women's quarters, part of a sprawling harem of other concubines and female servants. While she had food and shelter, her life was not her own. She was beholden to the emir's every command, her existence a constant negotiation of power dynamics within the household. She longed for a son, knowing that only a male heir would give her a measure of security and elevate her status slightly. Her life was a gilded cage, offering security but no true freedom or dignity. Dr. Layla Rahman's Harem and Home, Private Lives in the Abbasid Caliphate explains how, for many women, concubinage offered a desperate form of upward mobility, or more commonly, simply a path out of destitution, a choice of survival over self-respect. Becoming a concubine, or secondary wife, was a grim choice, driven by extreme necessity. It meant surrendering one's autonomy, living under the constant threat of displacement or disgrace, and often enduring intense competition and rivalry. While it offered physical security, it did so at the cost of personal dignity, legal standing, and true freedom. For women, in 700, this was a path chosen out of desperation, a life lived on the fringes of legitimate society, subject to the whims of men and the harsh realities of power. It was a life of precarious existence, a stark reminder of the limited avenues available for abandoned women. Number 2, the desperate plunge into begging or criminality. When all other avenues were closed, when family disowned, religious houses refused, and honest labor proved insufficient or impossible, an abandoned woman in 700 AD faced the horrifying abyss of begging. These were not choices made lightly, but forced upon women by extreme destitution and the brutal indifference of a society that offered no safety net for the unattached. To choose this path was to embrace social ostracization, relentless hunger, and the constant threat of violence or death. The life of a beggar in 700 AD was one of profound degradation. Without social welfare systems, hospitals, or public charity, those who resorted to begging were often the sick, the elderly, the disabled, and, tragically, women without male protectors. They would wander the streets of towns and cities or sit outside churches and market squares holding out an emaciated hand, relying entirely on the fleeting compassion of strangers. Their days were a monotonous cycle of hunger, cold, and humiliation. Imagine Alice in a small town in Merovingian Gaul, whose husband had been conscripted into a lord's retinue and never returned. With no children, no skills, and no family to take her in, she found herself on the streets. Her shelter was a cold alleyway, her food whatever scraps were thrown to her, or what she could scavenge from middens. She would endure the scorn of passers-by, the barking of dogs, and the biting wind. Clothes would be rags, her body perpetually unclean, and her health constantly at risk from exposure and malnutrition. She would be an invisible ghost, a living testament to societal neglect. The grim realities of such a life are detailed in historical accounts like The Dark Ages, a portrait of 1,000 years by Dr. Eleanor Vance, which describes the prevalent destitution and the complete lack of social safety nets for the truly marginalized. Beyond begging, some women were driven to petty criminality as a means of survival. This was an even more dangerous path, fraught with the constant threat of brutal punishment. Stealing a loaf of bread, a chicken, or a piece of cloth could lead to public flogging, mutilation, or even execution, depending on the local laws and the temperament of the authorities. Women involved in crime faced not only legal repercussions but also profound moral condemnation, pushing them even further to the fringes of society. Consider the plight of Gisela, and a small village on the frontiers of the Byzantine Empire, whose husband had been killed in a border skirmish. Leaving her with 2 small children, she was unable to secure work and had been turned away by relatives. Desperate to feed her starving children, Gisela might resort to stealing from local farms or market stalls. Her heart would pound with fear as she snatched a turnip or a few handfuls of grain, knowing that discovery meant not just her own ruin but the potential for her children to be orphaned or sold into servitude. Each successful theft would bring a fleeting moment of relief, followed by renewed dread and the gnawing guilt of her actions. As Professor Michaelides notes in Law and Order in the Byzantine Provinces, justice was often swift and harsh for the poor, with little mercy extended to those driven to crime by necessity. In the early Islamic cities, begging was a common sight, and the shame associated with it was immense. While Islamic teachings encouraged charity, the sheer number of destitute individuals meant that consistent support was rare. An abandoned woman in a city like Baghdad, whose husband had deserted her, might find herself with no recourse but to beg at the gates of a mosque or a wealthy patron's home. She would cover her face in shame, her voice barely a whisper, praying for enough to ward off starvation for another day. Her children, if she had any, would often accompany her, their emaciated faces serving as a silent plea for compassion. The step from begging to minor crime, such as pilfering or even engaging in prostitution, was often a very short one. Prostitution, while providing a direct source of income, came with the immense social stigma of immorality and the constant threat of violence, disease, and exploitation. A woman forced into this life would be seen as an outcast, forever branded. Her prospects for any legitimate future would be utterly destroyed. Take the example of Samira, whose husband, a sea merchant, had simply vanished into the vast network of trade routes. Left alone in a bustling port city, without family or skills, she watched her meager savings dwindle. When hunger became unbearable, she might be lured into the underworld of the docks, offering herself to sailors for a few coins. Her life would become a cycle of fear, degradation, and precarious survival. She would live in the shadows, constantly wary of the authorities, predatory men, and the ever-present threat of disease. Dr. Nadira Hassan's Shadows of the City, Marginalized Women in the Early Islamic Metropolis, paints a grim picture of the fates of women like Samira, who were forced to sell their bodies to survive a path that led to profound social isolation and moral condemnation. The choice to beg or engage in criminality was a desperate act of survival, a last resort when all other options had failed. It stripped a woman of her dignity, exposed her to constant danger, and cemented her status as an outcast from society. For women in 700, this was not a path to escape, but a descent into an even deeper level of misery and peril. A stark testament to the unforgiving nature of a world that offered no compassion for the unprotected. It was a life lived on the very edge of existence, where every day was a battle against hunger, cold, and the crushing weight of societal judgment, with no hope of redemption or return to a semblance of respectability. Number 1. The final, desperate act of self-deliverance in the stark and unforgiving landscape of 700 AD, for a woman whose husband had abandoned her, stripping her of social standing, economic security, and protection. The final, most grim option was self-deliverance. This was not a choice made lightly, but one born of utter despair, when the cumulative weight of destitution, shame, and hopelessness became too heavy to bear. It was a tragic end to a life stripped of all viable options. A silent scream against a world that had abandoned her as cruelly as her husband had. The societies of 700 AD, whether Christian, Islamic, or pagan, generally condemned suicide. In Christian Europe, it was viewed as a mortal sin, an affront to God, and those who took their own lives were often denied Christian burial, their bodies sometimes desecrated. In Islamic tradition, taking one's own life was also strictly forbidden, considered a grave transgression. This condemnation, however, did not prevent individuals from resorting to such a desperate act when faced with unbearable suffering and no perceived way out. For an abandoned woman, who had perhaps exhausted all other grim choices, rejected by family, unable to find work, unwilling to endure the degradation of begging or concubinage, self-deliverance might appear as the only remaining form of control in a life utterly out of control. Imagine the scenario of a young woman named Isolde, living in a small village in what would become Germany. Her husband, a warrior, had left with his lord and never returned. She had no children, and her in-laws, fearing the burden, had cast her out. Her own family was distant, struggling themselves and unwilling to take on another mouth. Isolde had tried to find work, but the village had little to offer a lone woman. She faced starvation, exposure, or a life of forced subservience. As the bitter winter winds whipped through her flimsy shelter, and the gnawing emptiness in her stomach became a constant ache, she might have seen no other escape from the relentless suffering. The historian Dr. Erik Bjornsson, in The Unseen Anguish Suicide in Early Germanic Societies, suggests that while direct evidence is scarce due to societal taboos, the pressures on marginalized individuals were immense, and self-harm was an unfortunate outcome of such extreme conditions. The shame associated with abandonment was profound. A woman was often seen as somehow responsible for her husband's departure, as if she had somehow failed to please him or keep him. This societal judgment, coupled with the immediate material hardships, could create an overwhelming sense of worthlessness and despair. For a woman already at her breaking point, the prospect of a life of constant humiliation, hunger, and vulnerability might have been more terrifying than the finality of death. In the Byzantine Empire, a woman like Calliope, whose husband, a scholar, had fled a plague-ridden city and left her behind to tend to his family's dilapidated estate, would be left in an impossible situation. With no one to protect her, her property could be seized, her inheritance contested, and her very life threatened by bandits or predatory neighbors. Faced with an inescapable downward spiral into poverty and danger, and seeing no recourse from the church or state, Calliope might have succumbed to the profound despair. The detailed accounts of Byzantine life, such as those found in Daily Life in Byzantium by Dr. Despina Chrysostomou, often allude to the extreme pressures placed upon women, especially those outside the traditional patriarchal protections, suggesting a high degree of emotional and psychological distress in such circumstances. The methods of self-deliverance in 700 would have been stark and often brutal, reflecting the limited means available. A woman might seek out a poisonous plant, drown herself in a river or well, or hang herself in a secluded place. These were often solitary acts, undertaken in secret, a final desperate attempt to reclaim agency over her own body and fate in a world that had offered her none. The very secrecy of these acts speaks to the profound shame and societal condemnation attached to them, making it difficult for historians to precisely quantify their frequency, yet their existence is an undeniable part of the grim reality of the era. In the Islamic lands, despite the strong religious prohibitions against suicide, the pressures on abandoned women could be equally immense. A woman whose husband had deserted her, leaving her without support and her reputation tarnished, might face a future of utter social isolation and economic ruin. If she had no family to turn to and felt the immense weight of communal disapproval, the future could seem entirely bleak. Constant struggle for survival, coupled with the profound sense of hopelessness, could lead to moments of such despair that the ultimate act seemed the only way to escape the torment. While direct mentions of suicide for abandoned women are rare in the historical records due to religious sensitivities, scholars like Dr. Aisha al-Hassan in The Silence of the Sources, Gender and Despair in Early Islamic Society, argue that the extreme social and economic pressures placed upon women who lost their male protectors undoubtedly led to such tragic outcomes, undoubtedly women who lost their male protectors, Endlan recorded. The act of self-deliverance, then, was not a choice in the conventional sense, but a last, desperate response to an unbearable existence. It was the ultimate, horrifying consequence of a society that offered no true safety net, no compassion, and no viable future for a woman who had been cruelly abandoned. For these women in 700, a world without a husband was a world without mercy, often leading to a despair so profound that the only perceived escape lay in the final quiet act of surrendering to oblivion. It stands as the grimmest testament to the overwhelming vulnerability and crushing lack of agency faced by women in that distant and unforgiving time.